All right, everyone. Here we go. I think that we're good to go. We're a couple minutes past 7 o'clock, and we're going to go for an hour here. So let me try to do this right. Let me see if I can get all this working here. Hold on. It's hard to do radio from home. Let's see if we can do this. This is Steady Habits, a Connecticut Mirror podcast. It's where we take a look at life here in Connecticut, what works, what doesn't, and how to make things work just a little bit better. This is our very first edition of Steady Habits Live. Each month, we'll join together with a panel of political reporters, professors, writers to talk about some of the issues that matter most to our state and to our country. It's safe to say that for the first couple months here, we're going to be talking a lot about the upcoming election. So first of all, let me introduce our panel. The Mirror's Capitol Bureau Chief and a brand new grandpa, Mark Pazniokas. Welcome, Paz, and congratulations. Also, welcome to CT News Junkie contributor and one of the sharpest political minds around, Susan Bigelow. Good to see you, Susan.
Thank you.
And also good to see Jonathan Wharton, a professor of political science at Southern Connecticut State University. Always good to see you, Professor.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate being here.
So, for this special program, there is on your Zoom screen a Q&A function. There's a chat field, too, that you can use to chat amongst yourselves, and maybe we might be using the chat field to chat amongst ourselves a little bit, too. But if you want to ask a question, if you want to have something addressed by our panelists, just use that Q&A, and I'll try to get through as many of those later on in the program as possible. As I said, we're going to be focusing mostly on the election, and the big news of this week, of course, the Democratic National Convention. I kind of figured we were pre-gaming the convention a little bit tonight. We've been watching it for a few nights already. I think it's fair to say, first of all, without anything having to do with the politics of it, without anything having to do with the quality of the speeches or who's been put in what position to speak, it's been a pretty weird convention to see. This is unlike anything that we've ever seen before. We were talking about this just a moment ago. Paz, maybe you can give me your sense. You've covered an awful lot of these things. What does it look like to you to see a quote-unquote convention that's just basically a series of people talking with cameras cutting from one place to another?
It really doesn't strike me as watching a convention. It's something different, and actually I think that's what they should do, and that's what the Republicans should do. You shouldn't try to replicate the experience of being in a crowded hall at a convention over 4 days or so. I've been to 7 or 8 of, I think 8 of them. And I love going to them. I really love it when they end because you're always exhausted and ready to go. But this is not it. From a reporter's point of view, the nice thing about being at a convention, aside from the hoopla and everything, is that it's like the world's largest focus group. That over the course of almost a week, you get to spend time with party activists, and they come from different, walks of life. They have different views politically. And every convention I've been to, I've come back with a really good sense of, I think, of divisions in the various parties, and what's the excitement level coming up, as well as just generally the divisions in the parties, the diversity. If you go to a national convention to cover the Connecticut delegation, a Republican national convention, it's quite the thing. The Connecticut, if from the Connecticut perspective, you may view the Republicans as, right of center, some real conservative, and then you get to a national convention, and these people are seen as crazy liberals, and right, Professor?
I can always be to the safe side, at least, Paz.
Last time the Connecticut delegation in Cleveland, the Republican convention, they were seated in front of the West Virginia delegation. And there were some cultural and political differences. The West Virginia folks all had signs that says, "Trump digs coal." And the Connecticut people were just looking over their shoulders all week.
Well, and here's one of the things, though, Susan. I think that Paz is so right about this. One of the things that you actually get out of a convention, say a Democratic convention this week, is a chance to see what some of the differences are. And for the last several years, we've been talking about a Democratic Party that has some really big differences in different wings. We have a more liberal wing of the party represented by and large by Bernie Sanders, but also Elizabeth Warren, and a more centrist part of the party represented by Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton and others. And it would be kind of interesting to see a convention in which there was that tension played out. But Susan, we don't see any of that because of the way it's being presented.
No, and it feels actually like a week-long infomercial instead of, it's not really like a live event where things are happening and there's people that can bounce off each other. It's very sterile in some ways. Now, some things that they've done I think have been really good. I actually rather liked their roll call that they did. They went to every single state. That was actually really good, I thought. And Rhode Island had the calamari. They had the guy with calamari standing right there. Great. Nice job, Rhode Island.
I'll say, actually, I'm sure everyone's probably heard about the calamari thing, and I want to get the professor in on this really quickly. I just want to play some of this for you here. It's just 30 seconds. This was the nominating speech from Rhode Island. It was happening on a beach with a plate of calamari next to it. This is kind of amazing. Here we go. Let's see if we can hear this.
Rhode Island, the ocean state, where our restaurant and fishing industry have been decimated by this pandemic, are lucky to have a governor, Gina Raimondo, whose program lets our fishermen sell their catches directly to the public, and our state appetizer, calamari, is available in all 50 states. The calamari comeback state of Rhode Island casts 1 vote for Bernie Sanders and 34 votes for the next president, Joe Biden.
I have to say, Professor, when I saw that, I thought to myself, it's such a great way. If you've got 30 seconds, right, and you're Rhode Island, you're the smallest state, you got to make your mark somehow. And they actually used it as an ad for calamari. Isn't that great?
And the restaurant industry, which of course has been affected and slammed significantly in our region. So it's very impressive that at least, they made that pitch. It was certainly a notable one. And getting back to even your earlier tweet, what the heck is Connecticut going to have as a comeback?
Well, that's the thing. Yeah. Well, what do you think? I mean, what should we have done?
Oh, a hot lobster roll, no question. Do it New England style. It would have been great to have it featured that way, just as a reminder in terms of what we have here.
Any ideas, Susan? What would you have used your 30 seconds for?
Well, I would have some delicious New Haven pizza. From Sally's, something from Pepe's, maybe the white clam pie, something like that. Something that's really, really good that Connecticut is always tops at. That'd be great.
Although I will say, Paz, I think that, the co-owner of Pepe's got in trouble with some people a couple of years ago because it turned out he actually likes Donald Trump.
Well, yeah. And the last time, I can't remember now, if it was the Democratic or Republican one, they skipped pizza claims because that can be very contentious, and they emphasized the invention of the cheeseburger in New Haven. I think that might.
I suppose you could go with that too. So Professor, getting back to other things having to do with this convention, there's the stagecraft of it, right? There's basically rock and roll acts doing little videos in between speeches that are very carefully crafted. A lot of video that you wouldn't normally see, although many conventions have gone to more video. Do you think that this sort of convention actually leads us into the future of political conventions, or do we start to see the reality that maybe these things are kind of dumb in the first place and don't really need to happen at all in the way that they have for so many years?
That's a good summary of my tweet from yesterday. Thanks, John. You make me sound like a great curmudgeon with that. Look, we have to realize these are pep rallies. You're not going to get anything significant out of it. It's for the party diehards. And I think both parties need to recognize that the majority of Americans, and this is true in Connecticut, are unaffiliated voters. The party leaners. They're not attached or affiliated with any political party. So what are you doing by supposedly expanding your tent out to do this? It's just a hurrah party, as opposed to something more substantive and something more policy driven. Also, one thing, John, I do want to add is that we're one of the few states in Connecticut that still do our conventions for the state, positions too. Like what, out of one out of like 10 to still remain to do it that way? I mean, we're a throwback. I get it. We're the land of steady habits. Don't beat up on this nutmegger for that. I respect tradition. But I guess the big thing is, especially as a former delegate for a couple of these conventions at the state level, is there a big question as to whether we do away with it, even at the state level? Do we amend it? Do we make it a hybrid? Do we really have to do it over a series of days? Can't we knock this out over one or 2 days? And what do we do to draw in more of these leaners, unaffiliated voters with these conventions? Because you generally don't. You turn them off, quite frankly.
Well, one of the things, though, that does happen on the first day of the Democratic convention, there was the array of Republicans who hate Trump, right? There's always this. A Connecticut angle for this is Joe Lieberman once famously spoke at a Republican convention. But I'm wondering, Jonathan Wharton, I'll go to you first on this. What impact does it have to, say, a John Kasich, who seemingly has been running for president for 100 years, and I still get emails from him all the time about his run for president, coming out and saying, I think Joe Biden's a good guy, and I think you should vote for Joe Biden.
Well, for me personally, I wasn't quite impressed by Kasich and the others doing that. Because if anything, most people tend to interpret it as opportunism as opposed to genuinism. So, of course, that's their prerogative. But for me personally, I'm concerned they can really taint their chances, and others who have concerns about not just Donald Trump, but any real concerns of being tied or tethered to a party that remains. So I was a bit taken back that some of them did decide to come out forward and to publicly take the stance that they did. I respect that they did it, but to me, I was kind of taken back by that.
Susan, as a Democrat watching this, what do you make of those speeches?
So from the other side, there's a lot of people in the party's liberal wing who hate this. They hate the fact that the Republicans are in the Democratic convention, that you're somehow that you're pandering to people whose votes you're probably not going to get anyway. And so it feels almost like an insult for all the people who are working for more lefty progressive causes. So it doesn't seem to help the speakers with Republicans. It doesn't help Democrats with the progressive base. So I don't know what exactly the point of it is, except for some people to have some headlines for a day or two and then disappear.
Yeah, and Paz, Kasich in his speech, he actually takes this on head on. He says a lot of people who are like him from the Republican Party won't vote for Joe Biden because they think he's going to turn hard left. And I know that he's not going to do that. And I wonder how that sounds to a whole big wing of the party that has rallied behind first Bernie Sanders, but also a bunch of other progressives, much younger progressives, who really don't want to hear an old white guy from Ohio saying that.
The calculation is that this is very different from 4 years ago, when a lot of Bernie people were convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to win no matter what. And they felt very free to keep pushing because they thought they were not pushing to really deny Hillary Clinton the White House, but that they were pushing the party's agenda in a different direction. That clearly is not the case this time. You saw how Senator Sanders quickly got behind Joe Biden. And that's a very different dynamic. So the calculation is you're not going to lose people on the left by doing this. And there may be some folks in the middle. I don't know. I don't know how effective these things are, other than in this environment, there is a desire, I think, on the part of the Biden camp to really have people accept him, I think, is almost a transitional figure. That, okay, we've had 4 years of craziness. You may not, on the left, the right, the center, you may not be terribly enthused about the prospect of a 78-year-old president who has a habit of making gaffes, but at least when he makes them, caustic attacks on people. And I just think that's the calculation. And if you look at the Connecticut presidential primary, there were 22% of Republicans who bothered to vote in a meaningless presidential primary and not vote for Donald Trump. And there were many communities, well, not many communities, there were probably a dozen communities where, you know, a good 25, 30% of the Republicans either voted uncommitted or for this, you know, minor candidate, Rocky De La Fuente. So, I mean, there is that dynamic. There, you know, the question is, can you make those folks comfortable enough to vote for Biden? And I think some of it's going to be depending on what state you're in. If you are in a swing state, you have a real decision to make about your own politics, your desires for what you want the U.S. Supreme Court to look like. If you are a conservative Republican, you know, might you say, well, the court, for a conservative point of view, looks pretty good right now, so let's just have a 4-year transitional presidency, you know. On it.
Susan, for you, watching this convention so far, aside from the unusual stagecraft of it, of course, forced upon us by COVID, what are some highlights? I mean, what are some things that you thought worked, maybe some things that you thought didn't work so well?
I thought, like I said, the roll call I thought was very good. Some of the speeches I thought were okay. I liked Jill Biden's speech last night very, very much. I liked Michelle Obama's speech. Some of these things, they feel like they have been created to be YouTube videos that people are going to watch over and over again and come at later. And those, I think, are the ones that's what they've done a pretty good job, I think. But then they have all this sort of interstitial stuff. They have, like, who do they have? It's Eva Longoria kind of emceeing the thing, which is odd. And a lot of it just kind of goes by. One I think choice that I think that they regret. I was watching some of this on YouTube, and they left the chat open, which means that all of the people from all of the worst parts of the internet can come in and type things in, and then they will appear in the chat box next to the video. That was a very bad idea. I don't think that they're doing that anymore. So I think a lot of the convention, it's like most conventions, mostly pretty forgettable, 1 or 2 high points, nothing to really complain about, nothing we're going to really come back to in a couple weeks, I don't think.
Go ahead, Paz. Yeah.
I think Susan was really onto something that I think if we view this as a TV show, you know, you want something that becomes viral, right? So the audience in real time, what is the audience that you get on YouTube in the next few days and weeks? Are there moments that will have legs that can reinforce a message? And I think Susan, you're really onto something with that. I think that was part of the thinking. Can they create some viral moments? And, you know, it'll be interesting to see what the Republicans learn from watching this to that degree.
And I think what they're doing, I think they're also trying to provoke Trump into making dumb statements about the different speeches, so that then that actually pushes them to go viral even more. Many more people were watching Michelle Obama's speech because the president had something to say about it. So that's another thing that I think that they're doing. I think they're getting under his skin very well.
What does our resident Republican think about what he's heard so far?
I'm not surprised at any of this. I think the Democrats are attempting to do what they can with what they have. And as Susan already said, it'll be fascinating to see what the Republicans have learned from all of this. Are they going to be nearly as savvy, or are they going to do things differently than what the Democrats have done or even portrayed? And yes, to get to both your points, Paz and Susan, you know, look, anything you can do to provoke or get under Trump's skin just gets more attention from the media. He's terribly good at doing that. And so that's a strategy that he has done as part of the playbook, and won't be anything new. I guess the one thing that I might have taken away from about this convention was, and most people remember very well, the fact that Floyd's brother at least was leading a prayer there, which was very sentimental. And so with George Floyd's brother doing that, I was really taken back by that. And I think most people were. And so, that kind of live moment, I think, can kind of unite people, maybe even in some ways, across party lines and writ large. And maybe that's the kind of thing, John, you're looking for in terms of those kind of moments that are more action shot, that are unexpected.
And of course, the speech is still to come later up tonight. Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama. These are some of the heavy hitters of the Democratic Party, and it'll be really interesting to see what Kamala Harris does. I think it's going to be probably less interesting for many people to watch what Joe Biden has to say. We've been hearing Joe Biden talk in public for quite some time, but I think some of these other speeches are going to be really interesting, and we'll also get a chance to see what Donald Trump says about them. Moving to the Republican convention very quickly, Jonathan, though, what do the Republicans learn from all this? If these are essentially pep rallies, but they're pep rallies that are meant to, in some ways, heal divides, figure out ways in which different fractions of the party can all be heard, what does a Republican convention look like this year in the era of Trump? I mean, if you and other what we'll call Connecticut Republicans show up there at an actual live convention, you probably wouldn't even recognize the party that you're part of. What will this convention look like?
Well, let me say this. I think I differentiate what goes on between the RNC and certainly what goes on here in Connecticut. So I can't speak for everybody who's a Republican in Connecticut in that respect, because some people would understand it, some people would hate me for it. But I will say that what I would expect out of this potential convention would be probably more or less a hybrid, finding aspects of what the Democrats have done, taking what could be emphasized, the concerns that surround the future of America, in that what can be emphasized of a Trump presidency for another term. In other words, what is it to mean to be an American now in this era? And so that's going to be one that I'm sure will be highlighted over and over again, because that's been part of his branding for a long time. So it'll be a reminder really of essentially 4 years ago.
Yeah. And Susan, what do you expect to see?
I expect to see something that's going to be a little less polished than the Democratic convention, just because they have had a lot less time. They weren't even really sure what they were going to do for a convention until not too long ago. There was still up in the air the idea of Trump accepting the nation in front of a crowd somewhere, like in Jacksonville. So I feel like, and the Democrats have been getting ready for their convention for months. They've been planning out what they're going to do, what it's going to look like. So it's going to be interesting to see what the Republicans actually do. It's not going to be, I don't think, as slick. It's not going to be as well produced, perhaps. We'll see. I mean, maybe it will be. But I think that there's also going to be a lot more kind of interesting, maybe different live moments, that sort of thing. I do suspect that there's going to be a lot of moments that get people on Twitter and YouTube all riled up. I think that's another part of what they're trying to do. They have some very incendiary speakers, people who have been cultural flashpoints, and that's another part of the Trump brand, is to bring out people like that, like the people who were waving guns in St. Louis at the Black Lives Matter protesters. They're going to speak. I don't know what they're going to say. I'm a little afraid of what they're going to say. But that I think is getting at the brand that at least Trump wants to have for this convention. So instead of the Democratic convention, which is sort of like a very nice, Joe Biden is a good guy, America is still a good place, then we get to the Republican convention, which is going to be, I think, a little darker.
Yeah, but I think one thing, Paz, that's interesting, and it's fair to say that Donald Trump is unlike any president we've ever had. So it's hard to draw any real parallels here. But you would normally try to, as Susan said, run, and the professor said, run on the record. I'm not necessarily sure that that's what's going to happen. We're not going to hear speeches about, I don't think, about the positive state of the economy, because right now it's not in good shape. What are we going to hear?
Well, I think we're going to hear some themes that we saw in Cleveland. The party and the president portrayed America as a very scary place 4 years ago. They ignored the criminal trends and made America's cities to be what they were perhaps in the mid 70s, in the days of the Bronx's burning and whatnot. I think based on what we know about the speakers coming up, they're going to hit some of those tones. It's going to be police accountability. It's going to be Blue Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter. So I don't think there's any doubt that you're going to see a divisive message. The president's strategy always has been to maintain a base and hope that base is just enough to get him over the top. The other question will be, how will the president himself perform? This is somebody who thrives on live audiences, whether that audience is 10,000 adoring fans or 20 or 30, pricky reporters who are going over. He, even as much as he says he hates the press, he clearly prefers those interactions. And that's what we saw during his coronavirus briefings, which became fairly entertaining television, but were not terribly productive for the president, and his staff eventually got him to stop doing it and, put Fauci and Birx and the rest of them up front again. So, that's one thing I'll be looking for is, how does the president himself come to terms with the fact that he's not going to be working with an audience?
And let me add to that too, John, if you don't mind.
Please.
I'm certain, as I'm sure you all have already heard, that they're really going to go after Biden on the fact that he has been a public official, for nearly half century, for over 40 years. And I think that that's going to be the script that they're going to be using and hitting home over and over again in terms of being on the defense about somebody who has been in office, public life for decades. So I'm certain that that's going to be emphasized. That's where the ads are aiming to go anyway.
I want to actually turn to the Republican Party at the state level, and the chaos, I think, is a good term for what's happening with the Connecticut GOP. We've been saying for years the Republicans can't seem to put up reasonable candidates for congressional races. But I kind of feel like this past week, there was a rock bottom that was hit in some way. Paz, most people who are watching and listening have probably read your reporting about the saga of Justin Anderson, who's now the nominee to take on Joe Courtney in the 2nd District. You quoted him in your story as saying, "This is insane," after he won by 81 votes over Thomas Gilmer, the party-endorsed candidate. And he could be referring to so much there, actually, with just that simple three-word quote. I'm wondering if you could, for people who don't know the saga up to date, could you quickly, Paz, just get us up to speed on what exactly has happened here?
Sure. And I'm guessing anybody who's tuned into this probably knows, but yes, let's do that. So Justin Anderson is a retired correction officer, came in his possession a video that he purported to show Tom Gilmer, who was the party-endorsed candidate in the 2nd District, showing him assaulting a woman who was his girlfriend at the time. This was in 2017. This splashback on both of them. On Mr. Gilmer, for obvious reasons, he eventually was arrested the day before the primary, and he announced he would be withdrawing whatever happened on Tuesday. But it also splashed back on Mr. Anderson because he did not go public with any accusations. And he said he was in an awkward spot that the woman who gave him the video was reluctant to step forward as well. So he pressed the state party leaders, J.R. Romano, the chair, among others, to induce Mr. Gilmer to step down. And that gets very dicey. There's an element of coercion here that feels a little bit like blackmailing, when it's not out in the open. So it became this very awkward thing, particularly when it looked like Mr. Gilmer was going to hang on and win the primary. And if he had withdrawn, then the state central committee, which the professor used to be a member of, would have been in the position of having to decide, do you give the nomination to the runner-up, who had really ticked off a number of people in that district over his handling it? So it just became a mess, in that it's now reflected on the party. Domestic violence in any time is and should be a serious issue, but more so right now after the Me Too movement. There's a huge gender gap that the president is laboring to close. So this all kind of turned what should have been a footnote on primary night, because let's be honest, until Joe Courtney retires, this is probably not going to be a competitive seat. You know, the Republicans there have generally been doing about 35% in the general elections against Joe, even though this was a Republican seat until Courtney won in 2006.
Yeah.
It just, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, and it's clear that in the second district, there is a chance for Republicans to be competitive if indeed you put up competitive candidates. And so maybe, Jonathan Wharton, let's talk about that point first, because we want to talk, I think, a little bit about the party leadership and J.R. Romano and what he knew and what others knew and what they should have done about it. But more important to this question, you seem to have an inability to run candidates that can be competitive, even in places where maybe if you put up a decent candidate, you could be competitive. Why is this such a difficult thing for Republicans in the state?
Well, let me counter that, John. As I was trying to offer over email to you and even to pass in terms of what he had said in his article, a part of it is it requires an awful lot of fundraising to run for Congress. I think we forget it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And most of these candidates are, if they're able to, even use part of their money or loan their money, which we saw obviously with both candidates in that district, tens of thousands of dollars instead. Fundraising is a very tricky area, and particularly for Congress. I'm not giving an excuse, but it's a reality. So you put in the fact that few people want to run for office, fewer people want to go up against an incumbent who's been in Congress for years and years and years, which is most of the Connecticut delegation. I mean, let's just face it. All right. And nationally, we already know 90% of incumbents get reelected unless a scandal happens or they die. And in Connecticut, it's no different. Then you throw in the fact how much money is required to run for Congress, which is in the millions of dollars. So how do you deal with that? In these instances, some of these instances, you're dealing with candidates who've never run for office before. So few people want to step up to the plate. Fewer people have the money, the resources, but really, we need to spend more time on the fundraising prowess that's required to run for office in general. But for Congress, it's almost impossible. And I will tell you, as somebody who, yes, as Paz said, served on the state central committee, who stepped down only a couple months ago, and I was not aware of any of these allegations, quite frankly. I wasn't even aware that even JR was aware of these instances. A lot of this was shocking to somebody like me. And I will admit that morning, I got slammed with text messages and phone calls early in the morning. And I think you guys know, I'm not an early bird. So for me to be slammed with all this, on a Tuesday morning primary, is like, what is going on? And so there were a lot of things that took place, obviously, in headquarters that they had to deal with. A lot of this came out really on Monday going into Tuesday. And it was an unfortunate turn of events. But in terms of finding and recruiting candidates, it's the fundraising aspect that is the biggest hurdle. And this is all pre-Trump. Yeah. So you can throw in all the Trump fact you want, but this is really on top of everything else.
Paz, quickly, and then I want to hear from Susan.
Really much deeper than that. You on the Democratic side, you have people who will give up a safe Democratic legislative seat and go for it. And the Republicans won't. That's like a whole nother show, because Republicans, maybe not this cycle, but generally are competitive in Connecticut. The races for governor are 50-50 all the time. But for Congress, I think it's just gone for a generation because of the national Republican brand. It does not play here, and there's no reason to, there's nothing that entices young, promising Republican state legislators to give up the General Assembly and go to Washington.
So Susan, quickly, your thoughts on this entire debacle, because I think we want to talk about what it means for the Republican Party, but it seems to be an example of people deciding that they're not entirely sure what the right thing is. And sometimes the right thing is right in front of your face. If you If you know that there's domestic violence happening, for instance, you probably need to do something about it. You don't need to sit on that information and hope that it just goes away over time. It's a really troubling series of allegations.
It is. And reading about what was in the video is some pretty awful stuff. What he did to his allegedly did to his victim. It's hard because in this situation, according to the woman who came forward gave the Justin Anderson was his name. No,
yes.
Right. Yeah, gave him the tape but said that she did not want him to go to the police with it. So that's an interesting sort of moral quandary. Back to her abuser, and then she would be in an unsafe situation. And I'm sure that as a woman in America, watching what's happened over the past couple of years to people who come forward with these sorts of accusations, it's not a safe thing to do. It can be very, very difficult and very hard. And it doesn't seem like they did much of anything. Doing nothing seems to be the absolute wrong play here, and possibly the most damaging thing that they could do, especially because this is the sort of thing that they went after Elizabeth Esty a couple of years ago when she had a similar kind of thing in her office where she knew about sexual harassment and abuse, but didn't do anything about it. And they slammed her, the Republican Party slammed her really hard and for not doing anything. And now they're in the exact same shoes and they've done nothing. It makes them look like hypocrites. It makes them look like they didn't step up to the plate and take on that moral challenge. So I think it would have been a hard thing for them to go to the police, especially if the victim didn't want that to happen, but at least trying to get that candidate out of the race, somebody that you don't want representing your party, that would have been something at the very, very least.
Well, so John, if I can counter Susan though.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of the fact that only a few people knew clearly on Stay Central. And really it was only gossip from what I've understood. And that's not giving an excuse. I get the reporting angle of what you're saying. And I also get the point of how this could be blackmail. Absolutely, both sides of it. But the reality was only a few people ever knew. I will also counter that a number of prominent lawmakers have come out against what has happened, and certainly have now spoken against even J.R. Romano, the chairman, about how all this was handled. So you are seeing some prominent people like Themis Claridis, even Bob Stefanowski announced it, a couple of days ago, who was a 2018 gubernatorial candidate, which kind of surprised me, by the way. I didn't expect him to come out like that. So I think you're seeing some people taking sides. Now, one bigger question, John, you might want to go after is, what is State Central going to do about any of this, and what is going to happen with JR? Quite frankly, the chairman's going to remain in there because his term ends in the spring. So this notion that he's going to resign or step down from this, I'm not expecting that anytime soon from happening, quite frankly.
And Paz, this is something you didn't expect to happen either. I will just say quickly that in your story, you have this little bit of detail that amongst the things that J.R. Romano did not do is he didn't consult a lawyer, near as we can tell, which is, I would think, one of the first things you might do. You might get on speed dial and say, hey, could you advise me on this? But near as we understand, he didn't even do that.
No, he didn't, and he acknowledges that. And that is one of the things that troubles some of the Republicans, because I think even his critics acknowledge he was in a very awkward position on this. Because remember, the man who's bringing the evidence is the opponent. But no, he didn't. There are certainly Republican lawyers who would have been willing to take that call and listen to JR say, look, I'm in a pickle here and I need some help legally and strategically. And that didn't happen.
Well, even Len Fasano, who's a lawyer, we can't forget Paz, was the one who said, look, how else could it have been handled except for the way that he was trying to deal with it? So, which is why he's been supportive of JR to begin with, which.
JR could have viewed the video. He declined to do that. And
Right.
Susan Hatfield, who was a state prosecutor and the vice chair of the Republican Party, could have viewed it. And then, regardless of what the victim or Justin Anderson wanted, she's a mandatory reporter, and it would have gone to the police. And so there are other things that could have happened. And I say that really being sympathetic to, again, this was an incredibly awkward situation that Justin Anderson and Tom Gilmer put J.R. Romano and other leaders who were apprised of this in.
And let me say this, Paz, along with you, John and Susan. I've been on a bizarre thread because I guess I'm still on, say, Central's emails. And, you know, there's this tendency in Connecticut of Republicans fighting it out against each other. And the tactic that Justin took here in this instance really plays out writ large. And it really, as I think you all know, upsets me because there's just this tendency that we might be 21% strong. I'm going to be sarcastic on that. Republican in this state. And the Republicans are nearly, you know, the Democrats are nearly double that number. So, you know, it's certainly a significant gap. But we have a tendency to kind of fight against each other. And I don't know if that's family or if it's politics or it's just nastiness. But it seems to be all the above in this instance in terms of how the candidates handled this.
I want to take a quick break, and we're not on the radio, but I still feel compelled to take a break for some reason. I have no idea why. It's just in my DNA. I'm excited to share some details about our next event, which we're calling Race, Sports, and Politics with Doug Glanville, former Major League Baseball player, current ESPN analyst, and a good friend of the Connecticut Mirror. Doug doesn't subscribe to the idea that there's no place for politics in sports. And in fact, he thinks we could all learn a thing or two from the way athletes of different races and cultures and religions learn to work alongside one another toward a common goal. It's a conversation that's been coming up a lot recently, and we're really excited about having this conversation with him. It's free for all Connecticut Mirror members, and that includes all you folks who are on this call right now. So go ahead and circle September 1st at 8 p.m. on your calendars, and registration for the event will open shortly. We call that an underwriting credit in public radio. It's really an ad, frankly. This is Steady Habits. I'm here with Mark Pazniokas and Jonathan Wharton and Susan Bigelow, and we're talking about a lot of the big political news of the week. Let's go to one of our questions coming in, and it's sort of one of the things I wanted to talk about anyway. We got a question here. The process of counting the absentee ballots and election day registration ballots and unknown votes for candidates endorsed by major and minor parties, it will all increase that bated breath period following 8 p.m. on November 3rd. As journalists, how long can you stand to wait for results, even just in Connecticut? And I think that this gets to the point of, look, we don't know how this is all going to happen. And Susan Bigelow, you know, you and I have watched these things happen for years, and we want to know results just as soon as we possibly can. But there's a really good chance that on election night in November, we're not going to know what happened in Connecticut, let alone what happened in the presidential race. And there's a lot about that that's pretty scary.
There is. I mean, thankfully, we're from Connecticut, where results tend to come in really late anyway, so we're at least conditioned to wait at least a little while, but this is going to be tough. Having races that are out there that are not decided, having especially the presidential race where we really don't know what's going to happen in the event of a Trump loss. Certainly even today, his White House press secretary would not commit to actually having him, you know, accept a loss. So there's always that awful tension there. What's going to happen? And those of us who remember 2000, when that race dragged on and on and on after the election, and how terrible that was to not have that certainty of here's the next person, our democracy continues in this way with this person going forward. It's tough. I think we're going to have to try to be understanding and be patient. We're going to have to try to understand that this could take days and days, that the number of absentee ballots are going to overwhelm the system, that there's going to be town clerks and trying to count these votes, and it's just going to take a really long time. So we have to try and I think be calm about this, and not try to push for results to be coming out fast. I think that's sometimes it's against our nature because we want to know what's happening as soon as we can. But in this case, I think the responsible thing to do is to say, all right, the voting has concluded. We won't know the results for a couple of days, and that's simply our reality.
Paz, did we learn anything from the primary, which was for the first time in Connecticut conducted with a kind of absentee ballot, an expanded absentee ballot system because of COVID-19? Did we learn anything about how well we might be able to do this in November?
Yeah, I mean, as far as getting the results, it really, it didn't work that badly. But again, you did not have really a competitive presidential primary in either. You had a handful of legislative races, and we did find out pretty quickly who won. And then, you know, even in the best of circumstances, without absentee ballots, given how close the second congressional primary was, that would have taken the amount of time it took anyway, which was a week, including a recount. But here's, I think, I think Susan is giving everybody good advice about just being calm on election night. But I would say that we should not be calm in September. There should be a demand for the Connecticut General Assembly to get off their butts and build an infrastructure that can handle the volume of absentee ballots that are coming in. Now, Connecticut has a bifurcated system of running elections. There's a heavy reliance on 169 cities and towns. You know, in the second district, you know, I was, you know, there was one precinct that was missing, and a precinct in Connecticut is just a polling place, and North Stonington. They just never went online and inputted the numbers because it's on the responsibility is on the locals to go into the state system. There is no state gathering system. It's simply a tool for them to use. So if your local registrar and town clerks don't input it, it doesn't go into the state system. And in the case of North Stonington, they didn't do it. They popped it in the mail, and that was that. And it finally arrived, you know, this morning, I think. So there's that problem, but we don't have an infrastructure set up. Voting by absentee, the counting is really no different once the envelopes are opened and this stuff is vetted. It's all up front, you know, and understandably so. To guard against fraud, there is a lot of work that goes into making sure that ballot that shows up is real, and that it does not duplicate something that somebody is doing at the polls. Despite all the criticism, the basics of the system are pretty reliable that way. But just that process of opening the envelopes and getting it ready to feed into the machine, that's what takes time. And so far, I don't see any sense of urgency at the General Assembly or even in the Secretary of State's office to say, we've got to ramp up for doing this, you know, and, you know, like in a dimension of 10 to be ready for this.
I believe that right now, I think the rule is that you cannot open the ballots until election day, like 10 o'clock a.m. on election day.
Correct. They moved it up this time, but there's no reason they can't do more of it earlier. And then there's the question of personnel. And that's the harder thing, because, you know, this is an enterprise in which you gear up with all the, by and large, a lot of part-time folks. The pandemic clearly complicates it. So, you know, I'm not suggesting it's easy. You know, people should not mistake my comments for suggesting it is. But there needs, I think, to be an effort to make this election work as well as it possibly can.
And Jonathan, what do you make of this? I mean, we're going to have an election unlike any other. People are worried about going to polling places. And honestly, we don't know right now what polling places will be like in November. I'm knocking on wood here, hoping that we don't have another quarantine situation in which we're all expected to stay home because there's a spike in coronavirus cases. But there very well could be. So absentee balloting or mail-in voting is going to be something that an awful lot of people are going to use. It doesn't seem like we have the infrastructure necessarily to do it. Maybe not the political will in Connecticut to do anything about it. Oh, and yeah, we've got this U.S. Postal Service shutdown, it seems, coming from the Trump administration that's making it harder for people to get all sorts of mail. A letter from your grandma, your prescription drugs, and maybe it'll be hard to get your ballot in. What do we do about this?
Well, look, it kind of speaks towards what Paz was saying earlier, and something I've emphasized in class over and over again. We forget in Connecticut, we love our home rule. We love our towns and our cities to make a lot of these decisions, including voting. And so do we see an effort, a streamlining process, a uniformity, not just across municipalities, but even at the state level, to step in and help function and make this operate? Quite frankly, as a former party chairman in New Haven, I saw moments on election nights where the Democrats and the Republican registrar voters had to work with each other, and they generally do, to get whatever they can to get these ballots counted. It is a nightmare in general to deal with election nights for a lot of these registrar voters. And I feel for them, because I've had to deal with it on some of these election nights up front in New Haven. And it would go on and on and on, and it never seems to end. Then you throw in election day registration, EDRs, which is always a nightmare to begin with. I mean, first off, there aren't enough consultants or moderators there to help make certain that people are registered, let alone that they have an ability to vote. And they're oftentimes doing this, at all times of the day and even into the night. So you throw in every scenario possible. And I'm still back, by the way, John, I don't want to forget about this, that one election where it was raining and the ballots got stuck and jammed. And I was dealing with that in New Haven. Again, as a party leader, I'm like, oh my God, can this get any worse? Let's just let it snow on election day at this point and see what happens then. Because you know one thing, this year, 2020, it's just, might as well just be thrown in the trash. It's been a tough year, and seems like it's going to get any better, especially as it relates to what we're going to be faced with, potentially in November under a pandemic.
I will say that even people who maybe disagree with you on a lot of things, Jonathan, will agree with the notion that maybe we should throw this year in the trash. I will. Yeah. I will say, I've been talking with various secretaries of state and other election officials from inside and outside this state for years about how we might redesign a system. And I guess I'm just wondering if there is some impetus, I don't know, Susan, to change the way we're doing this, if because of COVID, because of the fact that states around the country have shown that mail-in voting actually does work, as long as the U.S. Postal Service works, that maybe we might be able to design something in Connecticut that takes all this information and says, this is actually the way you conduct an election. This is the way that you do things. I mean, have you given some thought to this at all, Susan, about how we might change things, like one or two ways to make this whole election thing work better?
Well, yeah, and there's certainly been some legislation in the works to change a lot of the stuff that we already do for some time. I don't think it's coming up this coming year, but maybe 2022, there'll be a vote on a constitutional amendment to open up the voting process a little bit more. Because right now, absentee ballots are supposed to only go to people who have a good excuse for them. Technically, what the legislature has done is allowed COVID to be a blanket excuse kind of for everybody. There's no early voting. There's no sort of universal vote by mail. Some of the things I think we are learning, though, putting ballot collection boxes in front of town halls, for example, that I think works pretty well. I don't think that there's any reason why we couldn't have those stay after this is all done. I think that we'll hopefully figure out some better ways to actually get our elections done by using a lot of different processes instead of just kind of going and voting in person. I'm hoping that's what we'll see.
You've said, Paz, there's not a lot of political will to do something to really ramp up for this particular election. There's probably even less political will to do the sort of things that we're talking about here. Wholesale changes that get Connecticut, up to par with some of the states that do mail-in voting or early voting for several days in advance, mailing out ballots without you having to ask, like states like Vermont do. There's a lot of things that people do, and it doesn't feel to me like our state's ready to do any of that.
Well, what Susan was referring to about a vote possibly coming up, the first thing they have to do is change the Constitution. So. Yep. Initial step, because right now it's in the Constitution. It's a limited number of circumstances in which you can vote by absentee. And because there was a vote by this legislature, but it fell short in the Senate of being a supermajority. Republicans voted against it. In the House, they were supportive. So to put it on the ballot right away required a supermajority. So it has to be a vote of the next legislature as well, and then it would go on the ballot in 2022. But that's the first thing. And that alone doesn't change anything. That simply allows the General Assembly to consider legislation on how you would let people use absentee ballots. And there are Republicans I talk to who, perhaps not publicly, but they are mystified by the party's opposition to getting rid of, the very limited number of excuses. Because the way it's set up right now, we have, rightly so, we have deified, healthcare workers. Well, if you are a nurse or a doctor who's pulling a double shift at Hartford Hospital on election day, and you live in Hartford, there is no legal way in a normal year. This year you can, but there is no legal way to get an absentee ballot. The rule is, well, if you work out of town and you're going to be out of town, you can. Nobody thinks that makes sense. 30 years ago when my wife voted by absentee, because, actually she called it, she gave birth to a baby on election day 30 years ago. I'm sorry, 28 years ago. And there was no legal way for her to get an absentee ballot. So she just kind of fudged it, and nobody gets pursued for that as long as you only vote once. That's the important thing here. But it really is a silly system.
I'll very quickly ask my political science professor, Jonathan Wharton. So here's my plan. Ready?
Yeah.
It's a 5-day period of early voting.
Ooh, that's radical, John.
Okay, it's Friday, Saturday, Sunday, right? Monday, Tuesday. You have all those days to actually vote. You can mail in your ballot up until that point, but it's got to be actually received by the first day of that early voting period.
They do that in some states. It's called early voting.
It's actually called early voting. Although I think I forget, Jonathan, does President Trump think early voting is good or absentee voting? I can't remember. One of the two of them is great, and the other one's really terrible. I can't remember.
Think the president's actually against early voting, from what I remember, because Florida has it. And
That's right. If it's in Florida, no matter what it is, it's great.
Right. Florida is great in that respect. Actually, my own parents jokingly say, "Hey, Johnny, at least we have early voting. What do you guys still have in Connecticut?" They have never to kind of brandish that in my face.
Pizza. We've got great pizza.
That is true.
Well, one thing, I throw back my father's face wrongfully that we have lobster rolls. And unfortunately, he's now allergic to lobster. So so the thing is that, look, the thing is we should be more innovative. But getting that passes me point, we're not. We're very antiquated. We're stuck in our ways. Hey, to quote somebody with Atlanta Steady Habits. And so it's our reality. I feel like the longer I stay in Connecticut, the more I'm becoming a nutmegger, and it's really upsetting me. Because the thing is that something like this should be more innovative. We should be more proactive. We should find better pathways. But then the saddest thing is you're dealing with the state constitution. But one thing we can't forget is you got to get the political parties on board too. So trying to go through both state central committees, let alone the leadership at the parties, I mean, God, that's almost impossible. They can't even agree what day of the week it is sometimes.
I want to say the kid who was born 28 years ago on election day is in fact a doctor who is routinely working 14-hour days as a first-year resident. But happily for her, she is living and working in a state in which it's not a big deal to vote by mail. But otherwise, if she lives and works in the same city, and if that was in Connecticut, and again, absent the special rules this year, she wouldn't be able to vote.
Mm-hmm.
But, okay, go ahead, Susan.
Sorry, one thing that's kind of sad is that we actually had a chance to change this. I think it was 6 years ago. I think it was in 2014. There would have been a constitutional amendment had the voters simply approved it, which for reasons that still mystify me, they did not. So we could have had early voting, but the public simply did not get on board.
The wording was kind of weird, and I think it was 2014 was 2 lifetimes ago when it comes to political trends. I think we all
true.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to leave it there. We had some other questions about things that didn't have anything to do with elections this year, but maybe we'll save those for next month's Steady Habits, because I think that we're probably going to want to talk about What actually happens to our big utility companies after the power outage that left us in the dark for such a long period of time? A lot of other people have questions about what's coming up in this next legislative session, what's happening at the state capitol, and we'll be able to ask some of those questions as we continue to have conversations like this. I want to thank our panelists today, Susan Bigelow from ctnewsjunkie.com. Always good to see you, Susan. Go Whalers. I love your shirt.
Go Whalers.
Go Whalers.
Come back, Whalers.
I want to thank Jonathan Wharton, a professor from Southern Connecticut State University. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining me in a drink today. I really appreciate it. I saw you make a second Cosmo during the course of this event.
Maybe 2.5.
Maybe 2.5. Talking about the State Central Committee got you to that second drink. Thank you, Jonathan. It's good to see you. And Mark Pazniokas, the Capitol Bureau Chief of the Connecticut Mirror. Thank you so much. It's always good to see you, man. And congratulations, Grandpa.
Appreciate it. It's the one thing I think I can cling to for 2020. I almost took issue when you talked about writing off all of 2020.
Exactly right. And Paz's new grandkid, born on my birthday. That's not such a bad thing. It's a very good birthday indeed. Thanks to Kyle Constable for putting this all together. To Jess Friedman, who produces the Steady Habits podcast with me. By the way, if you're not subscribed to the Steady Habits podcast, it's really easy. You can do it wherever you get your podcast. Just hit the subscribe button. That way it comes into your feed. You don't have to worry about downloading it each and every time. You can also go to steadyhabits.org if you want to find the new episodes. I want to thank Beth Hamilton and her amazing Connecticut Mirror newsroom, and also thank our publisher, Bruce Potterman. Our Steady Beats are by George Mastrianis and Dave Swanson, and they're at Legend Studios in Avon, Connecticut. Thanks so much for joining us here on this special Steady Habits Live, and have a good evening.